Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and sending each and every one of you so much love. I do hope you're doing exceedingly well and keeping lovely and warm because it's still very cold out there. So don't forget to get that lovely hot beverage. How about a lovely hot cup of cocoa? Or you could have tea or coffee, but I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rolf and I'm from Colorado Springs, which is a city in the eastern foot of the Rocky Mountains, well known for the famous Pike Peak, which is the highest summit here of over 14,000 feet and a renowned landmark in Pike's Natural Forest, where you'll find plenty of hiking trails and a cog railway. Then let me not forget to mention the city that houses the Garden of the Gods, that features the most exquisite red sandstone formations, which many visitors to our part of the world find incredibly beguiling and bedazzling. And indeed they are, as they're so unique and incredibly rare. We have what I would describe as cooler, drier winters, a semi-arid kind of climate, so to speak, as the Chinook winds naturally afford a rapid warming influence over Colorado Springs, which does have a tendency to bring us variable, changing weather conditions. I grew up in the Black Forest area, which is heavily forested on the northeastern side of Colorado Springs, in an older home situated on 3 acres of land. Living out here does feel like you're living in the middle of the countryside, yet in reality, the main town is only about 10 minutes a drive away, which isn't very far. We live in an old house that was built in the 1900s, but was restored and renovated in 1989, and my family finally bought the house in 1995, and we subsequently moved in and never ever looked back, as we enjoyed living in such an idyllic part of the world. Our house was symmetrical in design with 2 stories, large windows, and a very attractive wraparound porch. We also had stables where we accommodated our 3 horses and took regular daily rides on many riding trails in the area, which was and is still very forested, hence the name Black Forest. I grew up here with my 2 sisters, Kirsten and Gretchen, and both of my parents. Growing up, my best friend Nick lived about an hour and 40 minutes drive away from me in Denver. I'd spend many exciting, memorable daredevil weekends at his home with his fun-loving father. His father was a proficient and skilled hunter and generously took us out regularly on hunting excursions. He taught and mentored us both from a very young age of about 11, under his strict parental supervision and guidance. He taught us everything we needed to know about hunting, and it became a huge passion for the both of us. Much as I adored my sisters, growing up Nick was like the brother I never had, and I enjoyed spending time with him, as we had so much in common with similar boyish interests that girls never really understood. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course. Nick simply refused to come and stay at my home again after he visited me and stayed over for the weekend once. Even to this day, he describes it as the most distressing, terrifying night of his entire life that he would never like to repeat again at any cost. It all started when we both decided to go snooping around the Lee residence near Swan Road in the early evening on our bicycles. My good-natured parents, whom are chilled, easy-going, laid-back kind of people, encourage us to let our hair down, so we were almost footloose and fancy-free to do what we liked. Well, almost. Our neighbourhood in those days was considered very safe, so they were nonchalant about us taking a quick bicycle ride in the early evening, provided we had our lights on and wore our helmets, which we invariably always did. I told my agreeable parents I wanted to show Nick the Lee house, which was the sighting of all kinds of very inscrutable, enigmatic, unexplained paranormal activities that were arousing a great deal of interest from television studios and paranormal researchers around North America at the time. They were doing reports and case studies on all the esoteric happenings at the Lee residence. "Are you interested in the paranormal?" my mother asked Nick curiously. "I am curious," Nick told her, "but I'm not sure I believe in all that stuff. I would have to see something before I actually believed it, but I guess I'm open-minded enough to be persuaded. I think you could describe me as somewhat intrigued." "Well, if you're going to see anything supernatural and outer-worldly, the Lee place is a very good place to start. There's been a lot of interest in the place recently," said my mother. "I have a girlfriend who knows the family personally. and she told me that they're not making things up, because she has seen for herself and heard very strange, ambiguous things at that house that cannot be explained and naturally defy rational explanation. Like what, Mum? I asked. Well, she said she saw these obscure, physical, opaque-like shadows that had a human-like shape to them. They appeared very menacing, and they were darting around the Lees' front yard. She said that they seemed intelligent and very aware, but also disturbing, because they weren't like your normal shadow people, they were something else. They had distinct humanoid, three-dimensional shapes that were blurred and hazy, and very obscure. She couldn't describe them exactly, but I could see by the discomposed expression on her face that she had really been rattled by the outlandish, incomprehensible phenomenon, whatever on earth it was. Do you believe her? I asked. Well, I don't see why I shouldn't believe her, darling, my mother said. But I haven't ever believed in the paranormal myself before, but then I do trust my friend's undetermined account, so I'm on the fence about it, I'm afraid. My mother went on to tell us exactly what she knew about the place. Everyone who lives in our area knows about the alleged paranormal activity that takes place in the Lee house, she explained. Even the most hardened skeptics and cynics have visited the place, looking to debunk the indeterminate claims, but they come away saying that there's something outer-worldly going on there. Some people describe the Lee house as one of the most haunted houses here in America, if not the world. One shaman, I gather, recently described it as being located on a rainbow vortex, which becomes like a railway road for the paranormal, that apparently can slip in and out of our reality at random. Then there are the strange stories about the Lees actually witnessing extraordinary ethereal light shows. I gather they came back one night, and Mrs. Lee described it as like 4th of July firework displays. They also heard eerie rustling chains on the roof at night, rattling away and making a very strange commotion, and they even heard celestial orchestra music, and I gather saw metaphysical shadows and spectral beings and mystical moving lights. So I don't know what is going on there. As you know, there is a military presence there that does a great deal of testing in our area, and even Mr. Lee himself, who's the biggest cynic of them all, was very concerned about all that military activity going on, and believed that in some way it could be connected to the military experiments that they were doing, and believes it might include psychic mind control or something, so no one really knows what is going on there. So that's about all I know, really, about the place, but I think it's a good idea for you kids to go and have a look, but make sure you're back within an hour, because I'll be coming looking for you if you're not, and that's a promise. Before long, Nick and I were on our bikes, riding towards the Lee house, ringing our bicycle bells enthusiastically. I was feeling very excited about the prospect of seeing something anomalous with Nick, as to be honest, I'd never really dared to visit the Lee place on my own, as although curious, I was not that brave. Your parents are so cool, said Nick. I don't know if my parents would let me go out early in the evening on my bike. Well, if you want to see something haunted, it has to be at night, I insisted. Isn't that when all the ghoulies and ghosts come out to play, I teased. Well, if I'm being honest, said Nick, hand on heart, I wouldn't really mind seeing something. Actually, I'd quite like it. We can't go into the Lee property, though, I warned, as they do have security cameras up. But we can have a look around the area, and that's about as good as it gets, I'm afraid. We stopped our bicycles and stared into the property, and although it was quite dark, we could see that it was a very large log home flanked by a few ponderosa pines and large areas of expansive turf. It looked disappointingly normal to Nick, and I could tell by the downcast expression on his face that he was expecting something a lot more sinister, shady and creepy. It doesn't even look remotely haunted to me, he complained bitterly. I thought you were going to take me to some spine-chilly, spooking, nightmarish place. But this could be anybody's log home. It's not even foreboding or ugly, and it hardly even looks haunted. I'm sorry, I said. It's a standard home that's haunted, I suppose. I never knew you were expecting something so blatantly unnerving that gave you the chills. I don't think it works like that with haunted houses, you know. Are you not supposed to get a creepy vibe from a house that's haunted, said Nick, looking decidedly disenchanted. I suppose so, I said, feeling disappointed that my very best friend was clearly unimpressed and disillusioned by the Lee home. I wanted to show him a good time while he was staying at my place, and I was failing miserably in my entertainment. "I tell you what," I said, trying to lift up the mood. "Why don't we cycle around the wooded area before we go back home? I've heard speculation from people around here that they've seen strange anomalies and light orbs in the woods." "I'm not sure I want to go," he said. "There's nothing out here for me. I don't believe in all that stuff anyway." I could tell he was so disappointed and vanquished, almost as if a small part of him really wanted to believe in the supernatural and that ghosts were indeed real. But now he was highly cynical about the matter and seemed rather disappointed. We were turning our bicycles on the road, and that was when Lee and I saw a figure walking directly towards us from the Lee house. He did not look best pleased with us, possibly because we were snooping. I felt like a kid that had been caught with my hand in the cookie jar, doing something very naughty. I didn't know who he was, for I'd never seen him before, but he was wearing a plaid shirt and blue jeans, and looked like he wanted to punch our lights out. In truth, I've never actually seen anyone that looked so enraged and angry before. I felt frightened and discomposed by his aggressive demeanour towards us, and his tempestuous manner. I suppose I couldn't blame him, really. I'm sure we weren't the first to go peeping and poking our noses around the Lee property after hearing rumours of the hauntings. "Quick," said Nick, "let's go." And we turned our bikes around as fast as we could, and that was when we could hear the indignant young man running after us. I was certain he was going to throttle us, and we sped away on our bicycles as fast as we possibly could. But despite our speed, he was only yards behind us. How could anyone be this fast, I wondered in horror. All the time we could hear his frenzied breathing behind us as he ran after us. In terror, we quickly turned up our driveway at home, feeling absolutely petrified, with chills down our spine. But to our amazement and huge relief, the young man was gone. Where had he got to? We couldn't even imagine. But all we could think about was one thing, and that was hightailing it back into the house as fast as we possibly could. "Did you see anything?" asked my mother, looking at our pale faces as we bolted through the door like heavy, powerful windstorm as the door slammed violently behind us. "No, we didn't see anything, but I think someone from the Lee family was chasing after us because we were encroaching by looking in on the property, and a young man living there chased after us on our bikes. He looked as mad as hell, like a rabid dog foaming at the mouth. It freaked us out and scared us stiff." "Well, that's a bit mean of him," said my mother. "I think he's overreacting, I really do. It's only natural to be a bit curious about a haunted place, and you're only meddling kids having a little snoop. What's wrong with that? It's only a bit of harmless fun, surely." "Well, they've probably had enough of inquisitive, nosy people snooping around the place, hoping to spot something anomalous," said my father. "I can't blame them. If I had people officiously sizing up my property all the time because of ghostly rumours, I'd do my nut. The poor man possibly had as much as he could take of the incessant scrutiny. How can you blame them for that?" Later that evening, Nick and I sat down to watch a hilarious movie, and we ate some pizza delivery my mother had ordered for us, and then we retired to our beds with thoughts of the hair-raising, terrorising bicycle chase now long behind us. "Don't you think it was odd, though, that the man was chasing us? He just vanished like that," said Nick as we began to retire to bed. "I mean, he was breathing behind us, and then he was suddenly gone. Now, you have to admit, that was rather weird. I think he was just trying to scare us, but I must admit he did get away very fast." "Well, he certainly did that," said Nick. "I can't remember being so freaked out before." "Well, you got the scare you were looking for then," I teased. Before long, we'd fallen asleep, and I was suddenly awoken to Nick shaking me violently. "Get up, get up, get up," he said. "Yes, what is it?" "He was here," said Nick. "He was here, right here." "Who was here?" I asked. "The young man. You know, the one we saw this evening? The one in the plaid shirt and the blue jeans?" "You are kidding," I said. "Did he break into our house?" "No," said Nick. "He was sitting right here at the end of my bed. He was smoking a cigarette and looking at me with vindictive, hateful eyes." "You are kidding," I said. "I'm going to have to tell Mum about this. You can't just go breaking into people's houses like this and lighting up cigarettes on people's beds. That's going way too far. I know we were snooping, but this is too much." "No, you don't get it. I think he followed us here," said Nick. "But he didn't break in." "What do you mean he didn't break in? How did he get in the first place? That's what I want to know." "He's a ghost," said Nick, looking at me with wide eyes. "And not a nice one either." "What?" I said. "Are you kidding me? This is a joke, right? You are just having a laugh." "No, I'm not," said Nick. "He sat on the end of my bed, smoking and glaring at me. And then he faded and vanished in front of my eyes. He has to be a ghost." I was absolutely gobsmacked at this startling revelation and had no idea what to think. I knew Nick was not inclined to make things up. He had a lousy imagination at the very best of times and was pretty pathetic at pulling off a big stunt like this. I knew he had to be telling me the truth. That night, Nick absolutely insisted that we slept together with the lights on and was convinced that the man in the plaid shirt and the blue jeans was after him in some way. After that very strange, curious experience, he never stayed at my home again because his encounter with that ghost had absolutely terrified him. Even when he returned to Denver, he slept with the light on every night for 3 years after the incident. But all these years later, I'm amazed that I saw a ghost because I promise you he looked so normal to me, and nothing about him made me doubt that he was not 100% real. Although the way he was running directly behind us on our bikes was decidedly odd and not natural, because no one can run that fast. I still never sensed anything outer-worldly about him, so I'm obviously not that sensitive to paranormal phenomena. So on to the next part of our incredible story that led to our extraordinary encounter with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or Yeti if you like. This was when I was spending a week with Nick in Denver. We were determined to go hunting for elk, despite the heavy winter, perilous, somewhat treacherous conditions out there. There had been a ubiquitous amount of snowfall in the area where we were planning to go hunting. I must confess I felt very excited about going hunting again. It had been a while since I'd taken down a sizable elk. I fancied refining my shooting techniques, which were getting quite good lately. I think Nick and I were equally as exuberant and eager about returning to our favourite hunting lodge for that quintessential hunting experience, which every hunter enjoys. We arrived at the rustic, pastoral, rather charming hunting lodge later that afternoon. I would describe it as a rather magical, almost whimsical, quaint rustic hunting lodge made from timber beams and sumptuously decorated with very cosy furnishings, large stone fireplaces throughout, filled with crackling, warm, hearty winter fires, drawing rooms filled with interesting walls of ancient-looking leather-bound books, and mounted animal heads from elks to bears. Nick and I booked a sizable, well-appointed and stylish, eclectic-looking room, together with 2 single beds. And once we'd unpacked, we braced the cold weather for a quick scout around the place. We went investigating the extensive variable terrain here, as we were well acquainted with the lodge. We came here often, so we were familiar with the layout of the land. Despite the freezing conditions, we heartily enjoyed our invigorating walk, scrunching the cold snow beneath our boots, while feeling the blistering cold wind blowing against our cheeks, which was punnelling quite savagely against our clothes. Despite the rough elements and challenging weather conditions, Nick and I were in no way discouraged, deterred or defeated. It would take a lot more than bad weather to disenchant us or disenfranchise us. Besides, everything was crisp and fresh and beautiful. It was like an enchanting, magical winter wonderland, as layers of thick white snow cloaked and carpeted the wilderness in a glistening, undulating fold of pretty white hillocks that looked like a sea of white moving waves. Even the mountains, hilly valleys and rugged outcrops were swathed in what I can only describe as the most gorgeous white icing on a Christmas cake, and icicles of pretty snow hung off the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs like fragile, dainty and delicate crystals. We began looking out for the perfect places to hunt. We glassed the entire area with our binoculars, and before long we found the perfect location where the elk were lying low. We had a general idea where we'd set up our blind for the morning's hunt. Nick and I had spotted a couple of sizable-looking elk taking cover in a low valley against a mountainous ridge that I believe provided some kind of windbreak for them and insulation against the volatile, turbulent climate. We could only hope that the weather would actually improve. It looked like another snowstorm was brewing, and we didn't want that to impact our morning's hunt, as come hell or high water, we were determined to go hunting come what may. At dinner that night, we sat at a very long table full of hunting enthusiasts like ourselves, talking about how their week at the lodge had been going for them. Most complained bitterly that the conditions had been rather unpleasant for hunting, but nevertheless 1 or 2 of the hunters had been successful in taking down a couple of sizable elk. It seemed that most hunters were sympathetic to the plight of the animals, as they had seen how the animals can suffer in these brutal conditions without easy access to food. I was delighted to learn that one of the hunters had brought boxes and boxes of apples to leave out for the deer, struggling to find food in these winter conditions. We were also informed that the ranch owner also put out food for the indigenous wildlife, which pleased me greatly, as I hate to think of animals suffering in these freezing conditions. The following morning, after a hearty breakfast, Nick and I set out for the hunt, while the other hunters preferred to stay indoors until the weather improved significantly. Granted, it was rather windy, but I was eager to get the blind set up for the hunt, which we did so efficiently. Suddenly, on the upper, treacherous ridge, I did discern 2 very dark silhouettes of men walking down from the sheer elevation. They looked like dark, moving shadows, gliding against the skyline. I wondered who on earth they were, and what they were doing at such a height, with such a mighty wind blowing quite fiercely. Let's not kid, it can be precarious at the very best of times, and you would need to be steady-footed, agile and fit to manage walking on what I can only describe as a rocky tightrope against a punnelling windstorm that could easily blow you off the edge if you weren't very careful. "They're completely mad," said Nick, fixing his camera on the men. "Oh my God, Rolf," he said, looking at me directly. "They're not human." "What you talking about?" I said, snatching the binoculars from Nick quickly, even though I had my own. Nick was looking at me with a stupefied, agog expression on his face, as if he couldn't believe what he'd actually been seeing. "Oh my word," I said, as I looked through the lens. "I think it's Bigfoot." I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was discerning. We were both so fascinated by what we were observing that we crept forwards to where the strange novel creatures were finally appearing. I had a closer view of them. I don't think fear even entered our minds, not even for a moment. We were exceedingly curious, and my heart was pounding and beating vigorously, but not with anxiety or apprehension by any manner of means, but from sheer excitement. I simply couldn't wait to get a closer view of the uncharacteristic critters. "Be careful not to be seen," I warned Nick. As the critters became closer into our view, they were swinging their arms and legs backwards and forwards, almost as though they were marching, but not quite. They seemed to be walking directly towards something with intentional purpose, as if they had a mission to accomplish. I observed that there was a large elk completely trapped in the snow, because I discerned its head above the snow, which would have been an easy meal for the Bigfoot. I watched them as they approached the large elk. It was sizable male, with very huge antlers, and was completely buried and submersed by the snow. It was clearly trapped, the poor thing. My binoculars were wobbling uncontrollably as I observed the scene unfolding before my eyes. The 2 Bigfoot were intent on digging out the elk, which I thought they were going to kill, once they'd removed the snow, but that is not what they did. Instead, they set the elk free, and it scampered away happily to be freed from its confinement. I studied the incongruous critters closely, as they were indeed very arresting. I could see that they were both male, with powerful muscular ripped torsos and very large gargantuan shoulders with impressive bicep muscles. They were covered in long black flowing hair, and they had very long arms and powerful legs. I noted that the head was shaped rather like a dome and literally sat on top of the head without the presence of a neck, much like an egg in a cup. At this point I could not see the faces very clearly, although I did discern that the skin was grey and leathery. Before long the critters glided away, and I thought we'd seen the last of them. I was so beguiled and bedazzled by what I'd seen, and somehow seeing the transfixing Bigfoot had stolen the thunder of the hunt, because all we could do was talk about the critters. We were also perturbed as to why these natural hunters had not killed the easy meal trapped in the snow, as it made no sense to me at all. Well, not at first, that is. Nick and I decided to continue with our hunt and made our way back to our blind. It was rather a long wait for any activity, and I was beginning to think we should call it a day. And then quite suddenly we saw a very substantial male elk coming within our shooting range, and I thought all my Christmases had come at once. I perceived that the elk was standing in the most quintessential spot, much like the bullseye in a dartboard. It couldn't get better than that. The sizable buck with his magnificent antlers looked around for a moment, sniffing the air, and then he started ferreting around the snow for what appeared to be some apples that had recently been thrown out into the area, which he began to chew. I focused with my Remington rifle on the creature and shot him directly in the heart, and he was down so fast. I was very impressed with my fine shot, even if I say so myself, because it was such a humane kill, which is something as a hunter very significant for me. The last thing I want to incur is an injured animal. "You really have got a steady hand," said Nick, looking at me impressed. "Now that was a fine shot, and a fine buck with a very sizable rack." Suddenly we heard a strange sound. The only way I can describe it as something very big coming into our range of vision. Then we saw them. It was the two Bigfoot that we'd actually seen earlier on in the morning. They glided seamlessly and almost floated towards our dead elk, and one of them seized it by the hands and threw it over his shoulders as if it weighed absolutely nothing. Now these buck, or elk if you like, are very heavy, and this thing must have weighed at least 500 pounds at a guess. But then the male Bigfoot were easily over 10 foot tall, probably 1,000 pounds and 3 foot wide, so perhaps it wasn't a big deal to carry something half their weight. Even so, it was very impressive to behold, and I was blown away by the size of these Bigfoot. As close up, they were Herculean, and that's not a joke. One of the critters held my gaze for a moment, with dark, soulful brine eyes that looked directly at me. Then I noticed how human the face was, and discerned that the leathery skin was greyish in colour, with a distinct prominent brow ridge, flat nose, and very deep-set eyes. Both critters looked at us very briefly, and then they just glided away. It was as quick as that. "What just happened there?" said Nick, looking really very surprised. "They rescued an elk this morning that they could have easily killed, and then they stole ours. It doesn't make any sense at all. Why on earth would they do that? It seems incongruous." "Well, maybe it's not as odd as you actually think," I said to Nick. "Think about it for a moment. They showed compassion to that elk. They wanted to help it, not harm it. It had been through so much trauma already, being trapped in that snow, I imagine. It was a sitting duck for predators, with no hope on the horizon for it. Its predetermined fate almost certainly sealed. As a hunter, I would personally not kill an elk stranded in the snow for those very same reasons. I would rather rescue the animal and help it. I think once you start unshackling and releasing an animal from its enclosure that's been trapped in, you become somehow bonded to it in a very unconscious way, without even being aware of it. It makes every human being feel good about themselves to help something in trouble. Given that the Bigfoot are almost certainly half human, why would it feel any different for them to rescue an animal? I actually think they relished and enjoyed setting that elk free. For me, it would be intrinsically wrong to shoot an elk in that kind of situation. It wouldn't feel right, and it would seem cruel and unkind, because the poor thing is traumatized already. I think every true, authentic hunter has a genuinely kind heart, and that's a real fact. We have compassion and appreciation for every living thing, which is why we hunt in the first place. We help manage deer populations. We enhance the natural habitat for indigenous animals. It's all very significant. "I get where you're coming from," said Nick, "and I wholeheartedly agree. But why did the Bigfoot steal our elk? Can you answer that conundrum?" "Possibly because they know or sensed we don't really need it, because we have other food sources available for us at home that they possibly know about, whilst they rely on the food of the natural world to feed them completely. In a strange way, I feel good to have shot the animal with such precision, but I'm not bothered it was taken off us, as it's a lot of meat for the freezer, let me tell you." "You have a point," said Nick, "but what you're saying is that they're very clever, intelligent creatures." "Yes, they are," I said. "I feel it in my gut. They thought we didn't need the buck for food, and they're right about that. I mean, I enjoy venison to a degree, but in truth I don't fancy living on it for the rest of the year. I like variety in my meat." "But we could have given the meat away," protested Nick, "to our friends." "True," I said, "but I'd rather the Bigfoot have it. They need it more than we do, especially in cold weather like this, facing those grievous winter conditions." "I agree," said Nick. "I considered this hunt of ours in Colorado to be the most memorable hunt of my life, and all these years later I know the critters we encountered were most certainly Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that was such an extraordinary story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Rolf. Until next time, goodbye and good night.